July 6th. They all gave their lives serving their country. Our hearts also go out to those who were on Storm King Mountain that afternoon and survived. Many are back out on fire duty now, putting their lives on the line to protect lives and property and natural resources. Director Dombeck and I have respect and admiration for all the 12,000 plus firefighters who are on the fire lines even as we speak here, fighting fires across the West. With the memories of these 14 deaths so close in time, safety is paramount. The full disclosure of the investigative report closes one chapter on the South Canyon tragedy. I have fully supported this process from the start and fully support Director Dombeck's comments today. Wildland firefighting is an interagency endeavor, and in tragedy too, we support each other and our people to the fullest. Those who were on the fire, those who supported the firefighting effort, those who did the investigations, and all those who continue to fight fire this season. They go in harm's way, and our thoughts and prayers go with them.
Our next two speakers will give you the story and findings in the report. The first one is Deputy Chief Mark Reimers.
The South Canyon Fire Investigative Team did not come to their assignment with any preconceived notion of why the accident occurred. Rather, we came determined to be as factual, complete, and analytical as possible. I guess I'll begin again. The South Canyon Fire Interagency Investigative Team did not come to their assignment with any preconceived notion of why the accident occurred. Rather, we came determined to be as factual, complete, and analytical as possible. We feel a strong responsibility to wildland firefighters everywhere, particularly those who lost their lives in this incident, to help reduce the risk of occurrence of the deep personal loss experienced in the South Canyon fire. Our report contains a memorial to the 14 who died. May we all be energized and inspired to be ever aware of the lessons learned from their sacrifice. I'll speak now to the investigative process. The two agencies began assembling an interagency investigative team the night of Wednesday, July 6th, the same day the tragedy occurred. As part of that action, a fire entrapment investigation group from Missoula Technology and Development Center was automatically dispatched and was on the site by Thursday morning. The team was assembled in Grand Junction by Thursday evening. It had strengths in all the aspects of fire management, fire weather, fire behavior, tactics, training, safety, and equipment. We immediately began assembling the facts of what had occurred. Priority was placed on detailed analysis of the fatality sites, interviews with survivors and support personnel, fire weather and fire behavior analysis. Representatives of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, participated in portions of the initial investigation. We understand, however, that they are required by law and executive order to carry out a separate investigation. We accepted the target of completing our report in 45 days. Based on preliminary findings, we issued safety alerts on July 11th and July 15th. Representatives of the National Fire Protection Association provided valuable advice throughout the investigation, and we're pleased that Bill Baden is here with us today. The report that you have contains an overview of the incident, more than 200 specific findings, which are then summarized into 24 causal factors, and then we have a series of appendices including weather analysis, fire behavior analysis, entrapment analysis, and the witness statements. Also attached to our report are our recommendations to the Chief and Director, which have been adopted as interim measures pending review by an interagency management review team, which will propose a detailed action plan. Now Les and I will try to lead you through what occurred in the incident.
As I talk about different events that happened on the fire, Mark will try to point those out on some of the visuals that you see up here. So just kind of bear with us, and we'll go slow and try to cover it all so you can all get the full picture of what took place. The South Canyon fire was located in central Colorado, about 7 miles west of Glenwood Springs. The photo shows Glenwood Springs, Interstate 70, Storm King Mountain, and the point of the origin of the fire. As part of the background, you have to understand what was going on in Colorado at that time. There were record high temperatures all during June. Western Colorado was in extreme drought. Glenwood Springs had only 58% of their normal precipitation since October of '93. Fire indices for July were the highest level they had been in 21 years. The number of fires in Grand Junction District were already twice what they annually have in a given year. Lightning storms during the previous 2 days to the South Canyon fire had already started more than 40 new fires. The highest priority was given to fires that were threatening residences, structures, utilities, and fires with the greatest potential for spread. There were 9 red flag warnings issued by the National Weather Service between June 1 and July 5th. At this point, I'll briefly summarize the sequence of events between July 2nd and July 5th, and then I'll provide a more detailed sequence for the day of the accident. On July 2nd, the South Canyon fire was ignited by lightning at about 6:30 in the evening. On July 3rd, the South Canyon fire was reported to the Grand Junction District Dispatch at 11 o'clock in the morning by the Garfield County Sheriff's Office. The fire was on a knoll overlooking Interstate 70. The initial size up of the fire determined that it was burning in pinyon juniper with a low potential for spread, and no structures were threatened. Therefore, it was a lower priority and would be kept under surveillance until more resources became available. At this time, all initial attack forces were restricted to fires with imminent threat to to life, property, or running fires. In addition to the 40 fires from the previous 2 days, 5 new fires were reported on July 3rd. On July 4th, 14 of the fires were either out or they were under control. 31 fires were still uncontrolled. No initial attack resources were available in Grand Junction. Some retardant aircraft were available, but winds were hampering aircraft operations. At noon on the 4th of July, the South Canyon fire was approximately 3 acres. At this point, the fire was heating up, and some individual trees were torching out. Late in the afternoon, fire engines were dispatched from BLM and the Forest Service. The 2 engines met on Interstate 70 below the fire. Firefighters could not reach the fire on foot before dark, so for safety reasons they decided to wait until the next day. On July 5th, a BLM and Forest Service crew of 7 people with Incident Commander Butch Blanco walked in and constructed Helispot 1. Then they started line construction on the west side of the fire. The going was tough, and their chainsaws broke. At 5:30, they left the fire to go back to Glenwood Springs so they could repair their equipment and get new supplies. At 5:45, just 15 minutes after they left, a load of 8 smoke jumpers parachuted in, and then they worked on the fire until after midnight. The jumper in charge of the 8 smoke jumpers was Don Mackey. Just after midnight, he ordered 2 Type 1 crews. By this time, the fire had increased from 29 to over 50 acres. On July 6th, the day of the tragedy, another red flag warning was issued, but this one was for a cold front moving through that would have high winds with it. This was the 10th red flag warning. 36 fires were still burning in the Grand Junction district. The South Canyon fire was now the district's #1 priority for initial attack. By this time, the South Canyon fire was burning in pinyon juniper and patches of thick gamble oak, which is very flammable fuel. The terrain was very steep, with slopes of 50 to 100%. At 4:30 in the morning, the incident commander and 10 BLM and Forest Service crew members walked back into the fire, and they started to construct Helispot 2. They worked alongside the 8 smoke jumpers that were already there. At 5:30 in the morning, the jumper in charge ordered a helicopter for gear removal and an aircraft with an aerial observer. Later, he agreed to use the helicopter for air reconnaissance instead of the fixed-wing aircraft. At 8:45, the incident commander and the jumper in charge discussed the strategy and tactics for the day. The strategy was to use direct attack, starting at the top of the fire. Tactics were to construct line on top of the ridge and also downhill on the west flank of the fire. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the incident commander and smoke jumpers turned in their radios and received a general radio forecast from the National Weather Service, which predicted windy and cooler weather with highs in the mid-80s. This was a general public broadcast. At 9:30 that morning, helicopter 94 Romeo with a helitack crew arrived. The incident commander, the jumper in charge, and helitack foreman took a reconnaissance flight and mapped the fire. After that flight, the jumpers were directed to start building a fire line downhill on the west flank. The fire was burning slowly at this time. At 10:30 that morning, 8 more smoke jumpers parachuted onto the fire and were assigned to help the crews build the west flank fire line. At 12:30, the Primeville Hotshot Crew superintendent and 9 crew members arrived at Helispot 2 by helicopter. The Primeville crew members were assigned to help the jumpers with the west flank line. The second half of the Primeville Hotshot Crew was delayed so the helicopter could make water drops on fire flare-ups. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a flare-up on the west flank forced a group of smoke jumpers to momentarily retreat. The helicopter, using a bucket, dropped water on that flare-up. This cooled the fire down, and then the jumpers went back to work. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, smoke jumpers and Primeville Hotshots stopped for a lunch break. Some of the smoke jumpers at that point discussed the number of 10 standard fire orders and 18 watch-out situations that were being compromised. At 2:30 that afternoon, 3 smoke jumpers and 9 hotshot crew members were told to work back up the west flank line to improve that fire line. The line scout continued to mark the location of the line downhill. The remaining jumpers sharpened their chainsaws and prepared to continue building the west flank fire line down the side of the hill. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the remaining hotshot crew arrived on the fire at Hellespot 2 by helicopter. They were asked to help with the fire line on top of the ridge. At 3:45 in the afternoon, the fire made several rapid runs with 100-foot flame lengths within the burned area above the line scout. Fire activity was increasing. The helicopter was being used to drop water on flare-ups and spot fires on top of the ridge. Then the helicopter returned to the helibase to remove the water bucket. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the fire blew up. A jumper, Tony Petrelli, saw the fire cross the west drainage and called the line scout to get out of the area. The incident commander told the jumper in charge to bring all the firefighters up from the bottom of the fire line. Within seconds, a wall of flame raced up the ridge on the opposite side of the drainage. The incident commander called dispatch to report he was losing the fire on the side where the homes were and needed air tankers. Between 4:14 and 4:18 p.m., the fire spotted back to the east side of the drainage, direct below the retreating firefighters. Now I'll take each group. There were 4 different groups working on the fire. There were the hell attack, there was up on Hellespot 2, there was a group working on top of the ridge, there was the people that were working the west flank of the line working back up the hill, and there were the jumpers that were at the low end. I'll start first with the jumpers that deployed their shelters, and they are at the low end of the fire line. First group is the jumpers that deployed their fire shelters in the safe area. There were 9 smoke jumpers in this group. The jumper in charge told the jumpers to move up the ridge to a previously burned out safe area below Hellespot 1. The jumper in charge then left to check on the line scout, Dale Longnecker, and the other firefighters on the west flank. The 8 jumpers headed quickly up the steep ridge. Partway up the hill, they dropped their chainsaws and gasoline. At this point was the first time they really considered themselves in trouble. Dropping their equipment was acknowledgement that their situation had worsened. The wind was blowing so hard that they had to fasten their chin straps to keep their hard hats on. They were enveloped in smoke and flying embers and could hear the roar of the fire. 6 deployed in one cluster, deployed their fire shelters, and 2 deployed slightly down the hill. By 4:24 p.m., all the firefighters in this group were in their shelters. They called the jumper in charge, but got no response. After 1.5 hours, they came out of their shelters and met the line scout, Longenecker, who had safely endured the blow-up near the lunch spot. He had not deployed his shelter. Okay, the group on the ridge. At the time of the blow-up, the Prineville Interagency Hotshot Crew Superintendent and 10 crew members, 9 BLM crew members, as well as 2 smoke jumpers were on the ridge line. At 4:04, the incident commander gave the word for all firefighters on the ridge to proceed to Hellespot 1, which was their designated safe area. Before they could get there, their path was cut off by an approaching wall of flame. Several crew leaders ordered everyone to reverse direction towards Hellespot 2. From that point, the incident commander and other crew leaders directed everyone over the ridge and down the east drainage to the interstate. These firefighters safely escaped with only minor injuries. The wind blew the fire down this drainage, whose mouth was consumed in flames 30 to 40 minutes after the last firefighter escaped. Now we'll talk about the group on the west flank. At the time of the blow-up, 9 hotshots and 3 smoke jumpers were improving and holding the west flank line. When the fire crossed the west drainage, the incident commander and jumper in charge ordered the firefighters up the hill. They had already started to move out when they saw the smoke start to bellow up out of the bottom. The jumper in charge proceeded from the lunch spot up the fire line to follow them to assure they were all leaving the area. Kevin Erickson and Brad Ha waited at the upper part of the fire line to encourage the crew coming up the hill. Erickson saw a spot fire ignite below the crew near the bottom of the drainage. He immediately called a warning to the jumper in charge on the radio, but due to the thick vegetation in the terrain, the firefighters could not see the fire that was directly below them. At this point, all the firefighters were walking in a line, carrying all their equipment. Ha later reported to me that the crew was unaware of what was behind them, as they were walking at what I considered a slow pace, tools still in hand, packs in place, and the sawyer was still shouldering his saw. As the spot fire rapidly spread, Erickson and Ha yelled for all to drop their equipment and run. Thrash, at the head of the line, gave the word to deploy shelters. As the fire raced towards the crew, Erickson and Ha, who were shouting encouragement, turned and ran for the ridgetop. They were quickly followed by Eric Hepke, who chose not to deploy his shelter, but to make a run for it. As the three dove over the ridge, 200-foot flames blasted over the ridge. The last jumper over the ridge, Hepke, was knocked down by the force of the heat and flames. Erickson and Ha tended to Hepke's burns, and then all three followed the east drainage down to Interstate 70 in safety. The fire overtook Kathy Beck, Tammy Beckett, Scott Blecka, Levi Brinkley, Doug Dunbar, Terry Hagan, Bonnie Holtby, Rob Johnson, John Kelso, Don Mackey, Roger Roth, and James Thrash. The Helitac crew. Richard Tyler and Robert Browning had been directing helicopter operations from Helispot 2. As the fire threatened to crest the ridge, firefighters dropping into the east drainage shouted for Tyler and Browning to follow them into that drainage. They chose to run along the top of the ridge above the jump site. The fire funneled through the saddle at the jump site and cut off a route to the east. The slope to the northwest looked relatively flat with rock outcrops. The route appeared to be the best. Flanked by fire, Tyler and Browning headed in that direction. In 150 to 200 yards, a steep rocky chute, 50 feet deep, blocked their escape. They tried to cross the chute, but died when they were overcome by fire in that chute. Helicopter pilot Dick Good dropped his water bucket at the helibase and returned to the fire to find the entire mountain in flame and smoke. He could not reach anyone. Of the 49 people on the fire line, 35 escaped and 14 perished. The fire went on to burn all of Storm King Mountain that day. Now Mark will discuss with you some of the causal factors we found.
You have in your packets the complete statement of the incident and over 200 specific findings that the investigative team documented. We attempted then to take those factual findings and boil them down into causal statements. You have the entire package both in the executive summary and in the overall document. I've selected some of those to bring your attention to. Direct causes, fire behavior, fuel. Fuels were extremely dry and susceptible to rapid and explosive spread. The potential for extreme fire behavior and reburn in the Gamble Oak was not recognized on the South Canyon fire. Weather. A cold front with winds up to 45 miles an hour passed through the area on the afternoon of July 6th. Topography. The steep topography magnified the fire behavior. Predicted behavior. We determined this by analysis. The fire behavior on July 6th could have been predicted on the basis of fuels, weather, and topography, but the fire behavior information was not requested or provided. Therefore, critical information was not available for developing strategy and tactics. Observed behavior. A major blow-up did occur on July 6th, beginning at 4 o'clock. Incident management, strategy and tactics. Escape routes and safety zones were inadequate for the burning conditions that prevailed. Strategy and tactics were not adjusted to compensate for the observed and potential extreme fire behavior. Safety briefings and major concerns. Given the potential fire behavior, the escape route along the west flank fire line was too long and too steep. The Prineville interagency hotshot crew and out-of-state crew was not briefed on local conditions, fuels, or fire weather forecast. Involved personnel. The can-do attitude of supervisors and firefighters led to a compromising of the standard firefighting orders and a lack of recognition of the 18 watch-out situations. Equipment. Personal protective equipment did perform within design limitations. In addition, there are contributory causes in the area of incident management. The initial suppression action was delayed for 2 days because of higher priority fires on the Grand Junction district. Support structure. The above normal fire activity overtaxed a relatively small firefighting organization at the Grand Junction District and Western Slope Fire Coordination Center. Detailed fire weather and fire behavior information was not given to the firefighters on the South Canyon fire. Dispatching procedures and communications with the incident commander did not give a clear understanding of what resources would be provided to the fire. Unclear operating procedures between Western Slope Fire Coordination Center and the Grand Junction District's fire organization resulted in confusion about priority setting, operating procedures, and the availability of firefighting resources. The lack of the Grand Junction District and Colorado State Office management oversight, technical guidance, and direction resulted in uncertainty concerning the roles and responsibilities. I'll let Les take from here, moving from causal factors to our recommendations.
As was mentioned earlier, our recommendations have been accepted by the director and the chief as interim management guidelines and have been forwarded to the management review team that they have established. They cover the areas that we thought were the main causes of the fire and tragedy. First part of it is weather, fire danger, and fire behavior. The recommendations we have in that area are: 1, we need to conduct a review of the National Weather Service's red flag program. There was a lot of red flag warnings, but sometimes after so many of them that people don't really recognize that there's a difference one from the other. The first 9 were all for lightning storms. The last one was for windstorm. A fire behavior analyst should be available to work in conjunction with a fire weather meteorologist. Fire weather forecast must be communicated to all fires. Spot weather forecasts should be requested for fires that have potential for extreme fire behavior or exceed initial attack or are in areas where red flag warnings have been issued. public weather forecasts should not be substituted for fire weather forecasts. Develop a strategy to improve the transfer of fire danger and fire behavior technology. Ensure that the National Weather Service Fire Weather Program be maintained as an essential aspect of firefighter safety. We need an organized live fuel moisture sampling network on Gamble's Oak. Gamble's Oak many times won't burn very easily, but when it reaches a certain drought period, it will burn very rapidly, as we found on this fire. We need to know when that point is reached. Under leadership, attitudes, and training, it is usually easy for us to say there's just a need for more training. We don't think training is the core problem. We think attitudes and leadership set the tone for execution of training received. There is a dire need to create a passion for compliance with the basics of safe fire suppression. This will occur only if leadership sets and demonstrates a clear commitment to safety. We must explore actions to strengthen the sensitivity to basic safety standards. We must evaluate training to ensure emphasis on basics of fire behavior, firefighting strategy and tactics, the 10 standard fire orders, and the 18 watch-out situations. We want to include the South Canyon fire incident as a training exercise as we train our firefighters. 4, we want to develop mandatory fire shelter training courses with refresher training. This should include time deployments, site selection in different kinds of terrain, and wind conditions. We need to develop guidelines for adequate deployment sites, safety zones for differing heat and flame scenarios to show the value and limitations of the shelters. Fire behavior and fire weather concepts should be annually reviewed and training by all fire managers. Standards for survival and look up, look down, look around. Training materials should be reviewed every 2 years to maintain firefighting qualifications. Fire shelter training should stress discarding packs and equipment when escape is questionable, and it is no longer acceptable to place packs and equipment in the fire shelters. Under management support and dispatch coordination, the investigation team concentrated on the direct causes of the fatalities on the South Canyon fire. We identified a number of findings related to management support and dispatch coordination. We also identified incident management control mechanisms and support structure as contributory causes. We recommend that first, a management review should be conducted of the fire and aviation programs for the BLM in Colorado. And second, the review should also stress the implementation of the National Wildfire Coordinating Work Group's work, rest, and rotation guidelines. Next is mobilization planning for above-average year fire seasons. Droughts are part of the climatological pattern, particularly in the western United States. A lot of years you'll go without very many fires, and then you'll have one year like this that you have a lot of fires. Colorado's west slope was an extreme drought as determined by the Palmer Drought Index. Glenwood Springs had 8 straight months of below normal precipitation. The Grand Junction District was experiencing a severe fire season. Fire danger indices in early July were at a maximum record levels that they had been in 21 years. As of early July, the number of fires were twice the annual average. Type 1 and Type 2 management teams had responded to 5 times the number of fires that they would respond to in a normal year. Our recommendations are that special attention should be given to analysis of how agencies plan and conduct fire operations to respond to the wide variations in fire severity. 2, procedures should be established to monitor the level of drought at fire weather stations. Fire danger levels should be compared with historical information, and the selection of appropriate suppression should be adjusted accordingly. In conclusion, after all of the review of what happened, it's our feeling that the firefighters and fire managers are engaged in a complex business with inherent risks. This requires skill, good judgment, and the ability to make difficult decisions. The South Canyon fire tragedy resulted from a series of judgments, decisions, events, and actions with serious cumulative impacts. No one person or unit recognized the interaction of all the factors on the incident that resulted in the entrapments. Firefighting safety fundamentals were compromised during a period of extreme weather and fire behavior in a highly flammable fuel type. This situation, compounded by failure to provide critical fire weather and fire behavior information to the firefighters, was the primary cause of the injuries and fatalities. As far as follow-up actions, we've already made 2 safety alerts that were prepared by the investigation team and issued by the National Wildfire Coordination Group at Boise in July. Our recommendations have been adopted by Director Dombeck and Chief Thomas as interim measures. What happens next? An interagency management review team has been appointed to review the investigations team report and develop specific action plans. Now, one of the things that's really unfortunate is a report such as this must focus on all the negative things. We look just why did these folks die. It leaves out a lot of the positive things that also happened, such as the good job that was done on the other 40-some fires that were going at that time, that were handled safely and saved a lot of homes and other things. Then.
Okay, I think we can work on some question and answers right now. If you could just stand and I'll call on you when you do. Congressman McGinnis.
Yes, Dan, Congressman Scott McGinnis, this is the district connect, that's my home. Would you just, very briefly, 2 things. Using your fire roll-up chart there, would you explain to the audience here, and then comparing it so they can actually see in the actual picture, the amount of time that it took for it to go from the bottom of the gully up to the helipad 1, and the time it took where it hit the other 2 to I think it's important for us to realize how short a period of time it took to travel that distance. And then second, I would like, if with permission of the supervisors, for Sue, who is a hotshot fighter, to describe the difference. Unfortunately, one of the national networks picked up the word overzealousness, which I think across the country has given these firefighters kind of a negative sense, when in fact I think it's an accumulation of error. So I would ask that there be maybe Sue could tell us the difference, as she has to me earlier, the difference between a can-do attitude and overzealous. So if you would first just show that time, and then maybe Sue can comment.
Let's go ahead and break that question into 2 parts. Mark, if you want to answer or Les, answer the time issue, and then we'll turn it over to Sue, and she can respond to that hotshot issue.
Okay. Mark's going to point out on the chart the times. It took about 2 minutes from the point where he's pointing to the top of the ridge, from where the spot fire started till it reached the top of the ridge. It's not much time. So from the time it started till it hit the top of the ridge was just 2 minutes by our calculations. I couldn't tell you the exact elevation, but the distance is about 1,900 feet. But we have our fire behavior specialist with us. Is that correct, Sue? There's a little over 1,900 feet that the fire went in that 2 minutes.
Okay, Sue, if you want to just grab that mic.
One of the major factors in the success of both the hotshot programs and the smoke jumper program, and in fact all the firefighting programs in the country, is the strong desire and teamwork that occurs on these crews. It's been many years since I was actually a hotshot. I started in the mid-'70s doing that and last did it in the early '80s. But these crews are asked to do extremely difficult work, long hours, very difficult working conditions, day after day of very, very hard work. And they develop a real spirit of teamwork and a desire to do their job the absolute best that they can do. They work together for long periods. They do a lot of physical training, and they develop what we call a can-do attitude. They're very, very good at what they do. And I would make that a distinction between that type of attitude and the other terminology that was used to describe their work.
Thank you. Next question, over here.
Who specifically failed to get the weather reports to the firefighters?
Who are you directing it to? Okay.
I can answer that. As we stated in the report, there were some procedures and so on in the dispatch records. As we stated in the report, there were some inconsistencies in procedures at dispatch, and it was one of the things with all the fires going on that just didn't get done.
Can you explain? In Grand Junction? Or
In Grand Junction, right.
And they never gave the report to the firefighters?
There was some fire weather information given to the incident commander early that morning. It was told there would be a cold front, there would be winds, high winds in the area. The smoke jumpers were also informed, the second load of smoke jumpers, that there would be high winds in the afternoon. In fact, they were trucking or busing in more crews, more smoke jumpers actually, because the winds they had predicted, they knew they couldn't jump the fire late in the afternoon. So there was knowledge that there would be high winds on that fire in the afternoon.
When was the red flag warning issued, though, and evacuated them?
Okay, the red flag warning was issued the day before, and no, it was not conveyed to them.
Back there, thanks.
Gentlemen, my name is Dave Mitchell. I'm Channel 7. Can you please tell me if any management people from BLM or the First Forest Service are going to be reprimanded in any way for the handling of the fire or mishandling of the fire?
We made no recommendation with regard to any disciplinary action as a part of our investigation.
Why is that?
Well, we found that there was a cumulative impact. A lot of people made some tough decisions. There was a lot of things going on at that time. They're all judgment calls, and we felt that the judgment calls were as good as you could have made under the circumstances.
Given what happened, are you comfortable having those people perform in the same position for fire seasons ahead? Will there be any transfers?
Yes, we are comfortable. We looked at all their qualifications, and we believe that they can continue to perform in those roles.
One more question, if I may. Some of the people in Oregon are saying to a former Forest Service safety officer, they knew the second they hit the ground, they were in trouble. They say they never should have been sent in there. What's your reaction to that?
Well, that's their opinion.
Are you right or not?
In that given situation, you could say that being a Monday morning quarterback, you could say, yeah, that they were probably right. But at the same time, there was, if we didn't fight fires under those conditions, we wouldn't fight fires at all sometimes.
One more question, I don't mean to hog this. These same people are telling the whistleblower and some investigators from outside agencies, they had a feeling that they were being pressured by the Forest Service not to put blame on Forest Service or BLM management. Was there any pressure put on any of the people you took statements from?
No, there was no pressure put on any of the people that we interviewed. We interviewed each person. In some cases, they chose to be interviewed as a group. You need to understand that the survivors from this fire experienced an extreme trauma. And so as we began our interviews, right after it occurred, some chose not to talk with us initially. Others chose to work with us as a group. But eventually, as everybody understood that our primary objective was to help make conditions safe for the future, they all cooperated with us because they have that same commitment that we do to prevent a future occurrence.
Okay, right here, you had a question.
Yes, Les, you mentioned that during the stop for lunch, 2 hours before the blow-up, they discussed violations of the operating orders and also the 18 firefighting commandments as they were. Were they complaining about being ordered to ignore these? Were they asking their supervisors, why are you ignoring these? Why did they go back and fight the fire if they knew they were violating these?
No, they were not really violating those. What they were talking about is that they felt like they were compromising them. They talked about them. They talked about such things as there was not a specific lookout sitting on top of the hill that could see down and see below them and see what was going on. They talked about some of those kinds of things. At the same time, as through the discussion, they discussed it among themselves and they decided they wanted to continue. No one asked them to go on or force them. And they did have a discussion with their supervisor along that same line that, again, they agreed that the right thing to do is to continue on with the fire line.
Kevin?
Both either Les or Mark. Which, you mentioned the 8 fire orders fire safety orders that were compromised. Which 8 of those?
Well, you can look directly in our report, and we've specified. It'd be fairly complex to list each of them, the same on the watch out. But what we did in the report is we moved through item by item, and that's a part of our factual finding. But for instance, one of the standard firefighting orders is determine safety zones and escape routes. When you look at that, you see that there's some judgment involved, and the judgment is, are those safety zones and escape routes adequate? And so that's where you would take the question of, was it compromised? Or it says establish lookouts in potentially hazardous situations. There were people looking out, but unfortunately they couldn't see the entire incident. So again, there was not an adequacy in the lookout. But those are the kind of judgments that people on fire make. These can't just be always this way or that way, but there's a judgment call. And so you can see a group of firefighters in a hazardous situation trying to think through the adequacy with which they're dealing with the situation. A similar thing is reflected in our watch-out situations.
Howard?
You've given us an enormous amount of information, all trying to digest very quickly. But can you summarize for us either what essentially this all says? Because what it sounds like is that, I hate to use the word blame, but it sounds like you're blaming the firefighters for not taking action that they should have taken, which could have prevented their own deaths, and fire managers for not taking action that could have prevented the deaths of the firefighters. Is that the summary of what this is all about?
Yes, I think you're correct in that if you look at the situation, you'd find a number of places where people could have made judgments or could have provided information that would have allowed it not to occur. Our conclusion is that no one person or unit recognized the interaction of all the factors on the incident that resulted in the entrapment. And so you can talk and you can think about the whole incident, and that's what we did. But we could see a number of places, if things were different, there would have been a different result. But you can't pin it on just one person or one decision.
It's similar to an aircraft crash or something like that, where usually there isn't one thing. It isn't one gauge that didn't work. It's not one engine that didn't fail or anything else. There's an accumulation of events that happened that led to this thing.
Okay, right here.
What firefighters then tomorrow and next year will come away with from this? I know you're going to have specific recommendations, very detailed recommendations, but are firefighters supposed to act differently now? Are fire managers supposed to act differently? And if so, how? In some sort of controlled way? Are they supposed to be, are they just not careful?
Yes, I would relate it to what I call a margin of safety. In everything we do, we have guidelines and we have to make judgment calls, and it's a question of having an adequate margin of safety when you're dealing with some inherent risks. What we're asking the entire firefighting community is to make sure that that margin of safety is adequate for the safety of yourself and those that you're working with.
Okay, right here, and then there are 2 questions back there.
You mentioned that there wasn't a fire behavior analysis either requested or done on this fire. Would one normally have been for a fire this size?
Normally, one isn't done for a fire this size, but since we had a red flag warning, it would have been good to have that. That's one of our recommendations, that a fire behavior specialist would be requested when you start getting those kind of burning conditions.
Okay.
Do you have the personnel to do that?
Yes, there are a number of specialists that are available. They're just requested. Nationwide, there would be people that would be available if they're requested in. There was not one available in Grand Junction at that time, though.
Okay, back there.
While not pinning the blame on any one person, one person could have made a decision that would have stopped this from happening.
I'm unwilling to do that. With my investigation of it, the number of people on the fire line, a number of people in the dispatching and other places could have made some decisions that would have helped, but it would be unfair to pick out one person.
Okay, right here, and then I'll move over here.
What is the likelihood that some of those who perished in the fire might have survived had they deployed their shelters?
2 shelters were in fact deployed in the group of 12. That analysis is contained in the entrapment analysis. You'll also recall that in another location we had 8 successful deployments. What you found that the heat temperatures in the area of the direct flame basically exceeded the capacity of the shelter. It was direct flame. The temperatures were calculated. In addition to the heat, there was also a turbulence effect, so that it was difficult to deploy the shelter. You have to, and I think this was a point that was made earlier, this happened so rapidly that in this 2-minute period that we referred to, that the ability to deploy and in the kind of heat and turbulence just made it unsuccessful. All of the group had fire shelters, and they were in different stages of using them, but it was just way beyond the capacity of the fire shelter. However, in another location with less intense heat, they were successful.
Aaron, Barry, and then we'll move back to you two.
Aaron, we were from Oregon and Portland. A couple things. First of all, they didn't really have a choice for better safe zones or escape routes. It wasn't like they just didn't pick them. They didn't have a choice. Given that, is that not another reason why they should never have been sent into this fire in the first place? They had no safe place to go.
In this particular situation, it was a very tough call. The fire, you have to remember, was just backing down the hill. It had been burning slowly for several days. It did not look like a threatening fire. Most of the firefighters that we talked to felt that it was not a threatening fire in any way when they arrived there. So they went in with the idea they could catch the fire and put it out. It really didn't show any real signs of much activity until the 6th of July, unfortunately.
Barry?
In the Mandels fire many years ago, the people who were killed in that fire disobeyed an order. And one difference that I see here is that Mr. Dickey survived, apparently by disobeying an order. He didn't deploy this fire shelter. He decided to run for the ridge top. Is there any review or analysis of the order, just that group of firefighters to deploy?
I don't think that I would interpret that as an order in the sense that you've described it. The smoke jumper did indicate to deploy. It was in the severest of circumstances among trained individuals, and an individual chose to didn't believe that deployment would work and chose to run for the ridge, was successful. When you look at the deployment analysis, it just all occurred so rapidly that I wouldn't picture it quite the way you described it.
Okay, back here and then back there.
Who was responsible for establishing the
fire lines, the escape routes, and the safety zones, the jumper in charge or the incident commander?
Well, normally the incident commander is responsible for all the decisions are made on the fire. In this particular case, there was a lot of discussion that took place between the two people and the other supervisor. When the superintendent of the hotshot crew arrived, there was discussion with him also. So it wasn't an independent decision that that's where we're going and this is what we're going to do. It was more, here's what I think we ought to do. How do you feel about it? Do you feel, like it's going to work? And they discussed it among themselves and decided that was the best course of action.
Okay, right there.
How can you continue to send firefighters out into the field when you know that the shelters failed in some cases and worked in others? How can they be the only safety tool?
Okay, the fire shelter is a last resort tool for the firefighters. The shelters have been used some 220 times in the past where they've actually saved lives. They work quite effectively. They were used down by Kingman, Arizona this spring, earlier this year, and where 3 people survived the fire. So they have a good success ratio. They're really an aid. They're not good for direct flame contact and high degrees and heavy fuels. So you have to get into an area that has some clearing before they'll really work properly.
Next question, right here, and then Kevin.
Do you have any estimate of what the temperature was in the location where the fatalities occurred?
Yes, the specific temperatures are listed in the entrapment analysis, and they're estimated at several locations. I believe in the hottest location it was in excess of 1,000 degrees. I think it was like 1,200 to 1,600 degrees, and then there was a slight gradient in the heat as you moved from the lowest location towards the ridge, and we would consider that in excess of the design capability of the shelter, where they were in the direct path of the flames, and in addition to that, there was the turbulence that made keeping the shelter secure and to the ground made it very difficult. But that is part of the entrapment analysis that was done, and we do it regularly, not only here, but in other places that's used, because it's part of a program to make sure that the shelter is the best that we can provide within a reasonable weight that it has to be carried, but it's always considered the last resort.
Kevin.
You discussed some criticism in your report that the management and coordination of management at the Western Fire Center and their dispatch. How much some of that due to the budget cutbacks that they've had there over the last X number of years, or were you able in your interviews to delve into that at all?
We did look into that, and we did find that there had been reductions in some of the initial attack capability at Grand Junction District and at Western Slope. Some of their seasonal firefighters they were not able to hire as early as normal, and their overall initial attack capability had been reduced over the last period of years.
Back there.
Can-do attitude that he suggests firefighters have permeates the entire fighting corps. You aren't suggesting, are you, that on a regular basis the firefighters around the country compromise firefighting standards, are you? And if they are, how do you rein them in so that they don't do that in the future?
We believe that the can-do attitude, not only with the firefighters, but other part of the organization, is a positive attribute that needs to be balanced with a concern for safety and a creation of a margin of safety so that accidents don't occur. And that's where we have to place the emphasis, in that balance between wanting to get the job done and ensuring that it's done safely.
Were they overzealous?
No.
No.
Next question. Back there and then right here.
In terms of alternate air supplies, divers use devices called pony bottles, which have 5 to 8 minutes of breathable air in them, and they only weigh probably 3 pounds or so, very small devices. Have you had any indication that you might possibly give them that equipment? And in this particular case, had they had those, could any of those asphyxiation cases have been prevented?
Okay, we have done research, and we're trying to develop new equipment all the time for our firefighters. In this particular case, the heat was so high at that particular point that a breathing apparatus would not have helped. It was the heat and the superheated air that caused their deaths.
Deborah?
Fatigue may have been a factor that the firefighters were working 12-hour shifts. Did that also apply to the dispatchers and the fire managers? And for how many consecutive days have they been working those kinds of shifts?
I think that you need to understand that typically on many of both the support structure as well as the firefighters, that a 12-hour shift is not atypical. It occurs frequently. We do have specific directions as to frequency in which people ought to have days off, so that we can maintain their alertness and their physical ability. And we did a very detailed analysis looking at the shifts. That was part of the analysis that we did, and we really only found very few cases where potentially somebody had worked too long a shifts or too many days in a row.
Next question, back there.
On the same topic, one of your recommendations is the implementation of the National Wildfire Coordinating Group's work, rest, and rotation guidelines, which seems to almost contradict what you just said. At least it implies these people are working longer than they should have. Were they?
We had one case where one of the Helitack people had worked 26 days straight. Normally we require rest after 21 days.
Next question. Okay, thank you. It looks like we're actually running out of time. Anyway, I'll take a couple more if you want.
What you think would be the most important single factor that contributed to a disaster?
I'd say one of the most important parts, let's try that again. One of the most important pieces was Gamble's Oak. Gamble's Oak normally is very lush and green. It gives you a false sense of security when you're working in it, and yet it is extremely flammable. It's cooler inside in there. The Gamble's Oak was 6 to 8 feet tall, extremely thick, and the people were building fire lines right along the edge of a burn where it had burned down and just burned on the surface of the ground. So it gave them a sense that they were working right next to the fire and in a safe condition. Yet the spot fire below them got to them before they could get out of there.
How familiar was the incident commander with that terrain and that type of fuel? Had he been on the site, or was he directing from the ground below?
No, he was on site. He was on the ridge. He had been working on the fire line the night before. He was working on the line that day up on the top of the ridge. He's a local person from Glenwood Springs area, had considerable experience in that area. But again, as I mentioned, as one of our recommendations is, we don't know exactly when does Gamble's Oak turn from a slow burning fuel to a rapid burning fuel, and it changes sometime during a drought period. The Battlement Creek fire that happened in 1976, where it killed 3 firefighters, in that case it was a frost that had killed the Gamble's Oak and made it burn extremely fast. This time there was no frost. It still looked green and lush, but yet it burned very rapidly.
Okay, I'm going to turn over to Mark Reimers for conclusion remarks, and we'll end the program and we'll talk about after questions.
We seldom separate from a friend or loved one without saying, "Be careful." This is particularly true if there are inherent risks in what they're doing or where they're going. That term has taken on added meaning for many of us over the last weeks. I was recently at the site of a bridge replacement trying to explain the meaning of the yellow and black hatched sign to my grandson. The ideas of caution, be careful. We hope by this report that we are raising the caution sign and when necessary, the stop sign. In our preface, we request each of you, those here and those that read our report, to review the findings, analyze the causal factors. We further ask you to provide the leadership needed to give an extra margin of safety in all that we do and thus prevent a reoccurrence. We owe a debt of gratitude to our firefighters and the research and support people that support them. They work to prevent loss of life, property, and natural resources. We ask for healing for those who suffered so deeply, and we express our sincere thanks to each who has helped us in our investigation.
We'd like to thank our viewers from across the country, families who are watching this program. We'll be ending this press conference. Deputy Chief Reimers, Director Rosenkrantz, Sue Husari, and Bill Baden will be available for questions if you have them. They'll be located in the corners of the room. Thank you again for coming.
The process by which you